In this video, I'm going to start making a new assembly or work table for the workshop. Plus, I'll clean up and fit a new vise to it, and I'll add some castors. For this build, I'm going to be using some lengths of reclaimed 2x6 pine. I think these may have been old roof joists, judging by their size and some of the old holes in them. But one thing's for sure, this wood is pretty old because the grain was really tight, so it was slow grown and much better quality than the stuff available to buy nowadays. Just look at those tight growth rings on the end grain. These measured 146 by 47 millimeters, and most of them were good and straight too. A good way to check that is to look down the length, where it's much easier to spot any bend or twist in the boards. And I chose the straightest lengths to make the table because I'm not going to be planing these to get them perfectly straight. That doesn't really matter to me for this project, so I'm just going to use them as they are. I made all the cuts with my circular saw and a speed square to guide the cuts, starting by squaring up the ends and then measuring and cutting to length based on a cut list I'd made of dimensions taken from a 3D drawing that I'd already done to design the table. My table is going to be 1800mm by 800mm and 900mm high, and I'm going to make some plans available for anyone watching wanting to build a similar style table, but the plans will be based on using 2x3 or 2x4 timber, which is much cheaper and more readily available and plenty strong enough too. Those plans will be available for free via my Patreon page if you're a patron, or at a small cost on my Etsy page. Links to both of those in the description box below. I did some sweeping up to clear the floor, and by the way, this is a new rubber floor mat that I'm in the process of installing. I'll cover that in detail in a future video. With all of the cuts made, I could start assembling two rectangles with some bracing supports in the middle for extra strength and rigidity. One of them is going to hold the worktop of the table, and the other is going to be for the bottom shelf. The rectangles were assembled just using glued butt joints and some screws. And I asked Google to figure out where to position the brace pieces so that they were equally spaced. Google, what's 1662 divided by 4?
The answer is 41.5.
Just to clarify what I did there, I measured the opening and then asked Google to divide that measurement by the number of sections there'd be, 4 in this case, and that gives me a measurement to position the centre of each of the braces. The brace pieces got glued and screwed in place too. And I'm using 100mm long screws for all of the joinery. I could then flip it over, check with my speed square that the braces were sitting plumb, and add the rest of the screws. Once I had the two rectangles assembled, next I could make the legs. I already had those pieces cut. Each leg was made up of two pieces, an outer piece and an inner piece, and the piece I'm holding up here is the outer piece. I marked up where it would be and then added glue to that area. And these big gluing surfaces are going to be what makes this table really strong. It's important to check that the legs are sitting square, and then I drilled pilot holes and secured it in place with more screws. With all 4 outer pieces added, I flipped it over, and then I could add the inner leg pieces, which were glued in place to the inside of the legs, butted right up to what will be the bottom shelf. Next I took some measurements for the shelf, and I'm going to be using some 12mm shuttering plywood for that. This is just the low grade stuff, the cheapest that money can buy. I cut it to size using my track saw, and I can't wait to get my dust extraction system set up so I don't have to keep dragging a shop vac around. That'll be a future video too, so make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon to see that in future. I can then mark up where the legs will be at each corner of the workpiece. I used the jigsaw to cut those pieces away. I did not expect this to fit on first attempt, but with a little bit of jumping around, surprisingly, it slotted right in. Next I added glue to the top of the legs, and then I could add the top shelf, and that slotted right in place too. And I secured that in place with glue and screws. I also secured the plywood bottom shelf in place with a few screws. No glue was used here, just in case I ever want to swap this shelf out for a new one at a later date. The table was pretty heavy at this point, so flipping it over was getting tricky. And the reason I wanted to flip it over was to add this. This is a record 52.5p vice, which I picked up on Facebook Marketplace for just £10. It doesn't have a quick release, but no big deal, I can live without that, and it's a really nice quality vice, but it did need a bit of a cleanup because it was dirty and rusty. I removed the old jaws, and I used some 4/0 steel wool and some 3-in-1 oil just to rub everything down to clean it up. There was some old paint to scrape off it too, and then I used some 120 grit sandpaper to clean up the areas that were more heavily affected by rust because the steel wool wasn't really cutting through it. I didn't take this as far as I could have. I wasn't really aiming to make it look like it had just come out of a factory. I just wanted it to be cleaner and free of rust. I then used some tape to mask off the handle because I'm going to be painting this vice using some Hammerite hammered dark green. I know some people are going to hate that I'm painting over the original colour, but it was the easiest way to make it look clean. Plus, if it wasn't green, then it wouldn't really feel like my vice. Some of you may remember my other vice restoration video, which was one of the first videos on my channel, and that one I painted with the very same paint. Unfortunately, I didn't have quite enough paint to finish the whole thing, as you can see here, but I got all of the bits that would be visible, and that was enough for me. I measured up the height of the vice and set my combination square to that measurement, and I could use that to mark up the area of the table frame that I needed to remove. I marked up the width by offering it up. I could then use the jigsaw to cut away the waste. Next, I measured this piece here and ripped another piece of the pine to that measurement at the table saw. And I clamped that on to act as a guide for my chisel to get those jigsaw cuts nice and square, because jigsaws don't cut all that accurately, and I wanted the vice to sit nice and level to the table. I then trimmed that piece to length and I could glue it in place to create more surface area for the vice to secure to. I also added another block at the back, and then I could offer up the vice and mark up the bolt hole positions. I added screws to the support pieces just to reinforce them while I waited for the glue to set. I could then drill the bolt holes using a really long 6mm brad point drill bit. These extra long drill bits make it much easier to see when you're holding the drill nice and straight. And then I added the bolts, and I'm just using what I have on hand here, which happen to be some worktop bolts. These will work fine. The final job was to add some wheels to the base because I wanted this table to be easily mobile. I had these Flexello castors which I found on top of a skip a long time ago, but they were actually brand new, still in plastic bags. Unfortunately though, none of these are locking castors, but I thought I'd try them out anyway to see if they'll be okay. I can always buy some locking castors to replace them later down the line if it turns out to be an issue. These had split compression fittings at the top, and the shaft of them measured about 22mm, but I didn't have a drill bit that size, so I bought a set of these Irwin Blue Groover auger bits, which had a 22mm bit included, and that worked great, and I'll link to this set in the description box below if you're interested. I could then just push the shaft in place and tighten it with a spanner. Flipping the table at this point was now even more difficult. I'm going to use the bottom shelf here to store some sustainer cases and my router table too. So this table is mainly going to be used for assembling projects, but also for cutting down large sheet materials. And I later decided that I'd make an MFT style top for it, which will be shown in a future video. When that video is available, there'll be a link to it in the description box below. I made the MFT top without a CNC and without any specialist jigs or guide systems, and the method I came up with to drill the holes accurately will all be shown in a future video. The table base was really simple and it came together really quickly. It probably took about half a day in total. And it's made entirely from reclaimed wood, so it didn't really cost me anything other than the cost of those auger bits which I bought. The timber that I used was obviously really chunky, but if you want to build a similar table, you could easily use 2x3s or 2x4s to make exactly the same style base. I just used 2x6s because I happen to have them. The ones I used were salvaged, so they had imperfections and holes in them, but that really didn't bother me. It's just a work table, it's not high-end furniture. I'm not the type of maker that needs to waste high-end materials like walnut and birch ply for something that's going to get a lot of use and abuse. Not that I have anything against that, by the way, but to me it just seems unnecessary. Originally, I hadn't planned to have a vise on this table. I already have one on my main workbench and also a metalworking one on another bench that was here when I moved in. But I think it will be a useful addition to be able to use it in conjunction with the MFT top. But I'll talk more about that in the MFT video. And in that video, I'll also add some new jaws to the vise. That's about it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to receive early access to my videos, exclusive content, free plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can help to support the channel on Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description box below the video. Thank you for watching.